Welcome back here at stage. Well, first of all, I'll try to focus on you. So, who was here yesterday? And who's from Denmark? Good. Who represents the private sector? All kind of private sectors. Public? Okay, good. It's just nice to know who we're talking to here. Thank you. So our next speaker is Mike Mutzel. Mike is a functional medicine expert with a background in biology and clinical nutrition. He's the author of Belly Fat Effect and focused on science behind metabolic health. Today, he will be sharing key strategies for promote long-term vitality. So let's give Mike a warm hand and welcome him here to the stage.
All right. Thank you. Good afternoon. This is my first time presenting in this way with the audio. How is my tone and pitch? We're good. Okay. So we are going to dive into all things metabolic health with a focus on muscle. And we have a smaller group today, so I really want to leave enough time for Q&A and answers. But we're going to focus on exercise and the importance of exercise as a tool to support metabolic health, especially in the context of reducing the risk of diabetes. I was doing some research in preparation for this talk. There's a lot of research from actually Copenhagen as well as Sweden in this presentation. Who here has a relative, friend, family member with diabetes or pre-diabetes? Quite a number of you. Who here tests their glucose or blood labs regularly? A number of you. I think all of you should do this because one of the most effective tools that we're going to talk about today is movement and exercise and supporting the health of your skeletal muscle. Guess which organ is primarily responsible for absorbing post-meal glucose after a meal? It's your muscle. Muscle absorbs between 80 and 100% of the glucose that comes into your bloodstream after you eat a meal. It's critically important, but it turns out that as we get older, muscle tends to go down. We tend to lose muscle mass and strength throughout our lifespan. And what happens is when we get diabetes, can't really see the pointer here. When we get insulin resistance, guess what happens to muscle? It catabolizes. So the worse that our it's a vicious cycle. Have you heard of a vicious cycle? We get more blood sugar dysregulation, we start to lose muscle mass. The loss of muscle mass leads to more blood sugar dysregulation. So it's a feed-forward cycle, and in today's presentation, we're gonna talk about ways to prevent that. So here's where we are going to go. Muscle, as you just heard, is very important for metabolic health as well as aging. We're also gonna talk about VO2 Max. Has anyone here tested their VO2 Max? I see a number of hands. That is phenomenal. This is something that you should do every single year. I've been doing this for the past several years. I've gotten older over that time, but also my VO2 Max has increased. You can get more physically fit as you age, and this will increase the probability that you will survive and not succumb to many of the chronic conditions like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Strength is a vital sign, but how often do many mainstream medical doctors assess your strength? Who here has ever gone to the doctor and had to perform push-ups in front of your doctor? Not a single hand is raised, just so you all know. But it turns out that the number of push-ups you can do right now will predict your odds of dying from a heart attack in the next 10 years. And I'm gonna share with you research that will support this. Again, how's the tone and the volume? We're good? All right, this is new for me, I can't really tell. All right, so we're gonna really dive into this. It turns out that your muscle is an organ. Okay? But this organ system is only stimulated when you move it. So people who regularly exercise have up to 600 more genes and proteins that are activated at baseline compared to people who do not exercise. So when you think of organs, you think of your thyroid gland, you think of your liver, you think of your brain. Your muscle is as much, or even in my opinion, as important as many of those different organs, because your muscle releases a litany of different proteins, cytokines, exerkines, myokines. But again, nothing happens until you move your muscle. And this is what I love about, I've only been in Copenhagen for less than 24 hours, but everyone is moving. You guys are doing a phenomenal job as a collective. There are so many people biking and walking. I'm very impressed. I am not seeing the prevalence of obesity and metabolic disease that I see in other parts of Europe, especially in America. Who has been to America in the last couple years? It's quite sad what has happened to Americans, is it not? We see rampant obesity, especially in children, rampant cardiometabolic disease. So you are doing much better in that context. But we can all improve upon what we're doing good at. And it turns out that when we move this organ with exercise, we release specific molecules that prevent many chronic conditions. We're gonna talk about preventing cancer, dementia, diabetes, of course, atherosclerosis, heart disease, according to the statistics that I read in Denmark, is the #1 cause of premature mortality. When you move your muscles, you're releasing specific myokines that prevent the accumulation of arterial plaque. Very important, and I'll share with you VO2 Max testing shortly. We're also releasing specific signaling molecules that reduce the risk of cancer, which is on the rise throughout Europe as well as in America. Dementia, as I mentioned, and moving your muscles is a great way to burn body fat and improve your body composition. So, we have a lot of things to talk about. This is a phenomenal study from investigators in Sweden. They looked at individuals who were sedentary, who had no history of exercise. They looked at endurance-trained athletes who had been training for 15 years, and they also looked at strength athletes who had been training for 15 years. And they wanted to see what were the main differences outside of the obvious. You might see here, we're gonna pay attention a lot right now to strength and VO2 max. Again, many of you have done your VO2 max test. Doesn't it suck? It hurts. If you've not done one, you should do one just to see where you're at. But it can be really painful, but it's a good way to assess your fitness. As you can see here, the VO2 max differences between endurance-trained athletes versus sedentary controls, it's about double. Now you might be saying, well, what exactly is a VO2 max? That's the maximal amount of oxygen that your body can uptake at your maximum exercise output. So it's testing your cardiorespiratory system as well as your muscles and your central nervous system. It's, in my opinion, and we'll look at research soon, the best test to assess your whole body vitality. And so it turns out that when you regularly exercise, your VO2 max is nearly double compared to people who do not regularly exercise. And that is associated with a dramatic reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease and sudden cardiac death, as well as reducing all-cause mortality. Really important stuff. But here's what's even more exciting. The changes in proteins and genes that are expressed. People who regularly exercise have up to 650 at baseline. And these are proteins being released from this organ that we just newly defined, known as skeletal muscle. This organ is releasing orders of magnitude more proteins and cytokines and signaling molecules in people at rest just because they habitually exercise. Really important, and it turns out, have you heard of mitochondrial health? Many of you. This weekend, have people been talking about, I was traveling. Mitochondrial health is, when we talk about brain health, preventing cancer, optimizing how we think, feel, and move, mitochondria are very important. This is how we create the energy. This is why we breathe oxygen, because our mitochondria uses that to combust the proteins, carbs, and fats that we ingest. It turns out that 90% of these proteins that are increased are related to mitochondrial function. So the point herein is that exercise is medicine for your mitochondria, is medicine for your metabolism and beyond. Okay. So I was doing some research about the prevalence of cancer here in Denmark. It seems that cancer is on the rise throughout Europe as well as North America. Who's heard about early onset cancer? Okay, not so much maybe here in Denmark, but we're hearing a lot about this in the UK and also in North America, Canada, and the US. It turns out that just 4 minutes of intense exercise several days per week can cut your risk of cancer by up to 32%. Okay, so there's not a drug that can do that. There's nothing we can go to our doctor and say, hey, can you give me a drug that will reduce my risk of cancer by 32%? There's just not. I'm not against drugs. I think there's many effective drugs out there. And in Denmark, you manufacture a lot of these effective drugs, like Ozempic and GLP-1 and semaglutide and these different drugs. But it turns out that exercise is one of the most effective tools to prevent cancer as well as heart disease. And we're gonna get into the specifics of what exercises should you be doing throughout this presentation. But let's talk about a very simple exercise. It's called walking. Walking is the most effective way to reduce your blood sugar. If your blood sugar is elevated after having, say, some amazing rye bread or sourdough bread, there's a great place on the other side of town I wanted to go to, but they close at 2 o'clock. I like to have sourdough products here and there. But if you do imbibe in a pastry, a croissant, some ice cream, did you know that if you go for a walk after having those foods, you can cut your blood sugar in half? And I'll share with you why that's really important as it pertains to reducing risk of cardiovascular disease. But we want to aim for about 9,000 steps per day. This is the magic. There was a meta-analysis by an individual known as Bannock. Bannock et al. Looked at 47,000 individuals, 15 different studies, with a follow-up period of 7 years. It turns out that individuals who walk 9,000 steps per day, when they compare their health outcomes compared to people who only walk less than 4,000 steps per day, there is a 40 to 53% lower risk of death. So if you take nothing away from this talk, this is the take home. Walk a minimum of 9,000 steps per day. Who here can do that? All of you can do that, okay? This is very easy. Yesterday I was traveling and all this stuff. I still managed to get in 10,000 steps, just taking the stairs at the airport and so on. Riding your bike around town, this is all good. Okay, so we're seeing early onset cancer on the rise. We're not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but this was an analysis. Actually, this individual here is University of Copenhagen. Exercise is a first-line therapy for 26 different conditions. By the way, these are common conditions: depression, anxiety, gastrointestinal reflux disorder, diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, respiratory conditions. The list goes on, okay? So a lot of people, at least in North America, like to gravitate towards these quick fixes, the latest pills, NMN, urethrin A. There's all these supplements that are really effective, but exercise is by far the most effective, and we have ample evidence to support this. So when you think about, gosh, do I really need to go to the gym today? Well, I went to this health talk, and it turns out that if I go to the gym, that will help prevent all of these conditions that later in life could cause me a lot of harm, financially and with life distress and beyond. So exercise should be part of your daily living. I'm gonna say it once, and I'll say it again later. Here's the protocol. We wanna walk at least 9,000 steps per day. We're going to break those up into at least 3 different walking sessions, ideally in the post-meal. So after you eat a meal is the best time to do your aerobic exercise or go for a walk, because it will drop your blood glucose and help you properly metabolize the meal. We also want to do resistance training at least 3 days per week at a bare minimum. We don't need to go to the gym necessarily. We can do resistance bands. I bring these in to share these on stage. Anyone own bands at home? Really simple. You can do body weight resistance exercise at home. Again, as Einstein said, nothing happens until something moves. Nothing happens to your muscles unless you move them. So resistance training, a minimum of 3 days per week. And we want to focus on compound movements, moving 2 or more joints at the same time. So a bicep curl is just moving how many joints? 1 joint, just your elbow. In contrast, if we were to do a pull-up, we're moving our shoulder and our elbow. That's a compound movement. You're moving 2 or more joints at the same time. A leg extension is just moving your knee. It's a good exercise, but a squat is going to be a much better exercise. When you squat, you activate over 200 different muscles. Remember, muscles depend upon stimulation. When we stimulate our muscles, we release a litany of genes, proteins, and cytokines that improve whole body health. So that's the main take home here. But let's talk about VO2 Max. Okay, really important. Has anyone heard of this study? Peter Attia and Huberman always talk about. This was one of the first studies that associated a low VO2 max. Again, this is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can uptake when you're exercising at your peak capacity. The more, the better. And as I told you, I think you should do this every year. It costs $100. This is at least in the US, I'm sure it might be free here, at an exercise physiology lab. This study found that people with a low VO2 max, which is on, for those of you, it's on the right side here, I'm sorry, the left side here, when we're comparing low VO2 max to a high VO2 max, there's a 3.5-fold increased risk of dying from heart disease. Okay, this is independent of other things like cholesterol that you often hear about from mainstream doctors. So this is one of the most effective things that you all can improve upon. And just personally in my life, I was wondering, can I continually improve my VO2 max as I get older? And I've been able to do that over the past 3 years, progressively improve my VO2 max by honestly not doing any structured exercise when it comes to aerobics. Just hiking in the summer, biking and walking, and just doing activities of daily living. You can improve your fitness as you get older. I think I have a slide on that shortly. So it's really important. This is quite significant. If there was a drug that someone took that could reduce the risk of dying by 3.5-fold, many doctors would be prescribing that. But it turns out we do have a drug. It's called exercise. So you might be saying, well, how can I improve my VO2 max? What about zone 2 training? What about all these? There's all these protocols out there. Here's my numbers. In 2022, my VO2 max was 48.6, which for my body weight and age was good. But I increased it by about 5 points. And then I don't have a screenshot. I just took it about a week ago. My VO2 max was 54.9. So as you get more and more fit, it's harder to get incremental improvements in your VO2 max. But again, I do no spin classes, no excessive exercise. I don't ride my bike for hours on end and do zone 2 training. Just hiking, walking, resistance training, and high intensity interval training, which can be quite painful. Does anyone do HIIT training on the bike or Concept 2? I think this is, when it comes to time efficiency, the best way to improve your fitness is to do short intervals at very high intensity and vary those intervals. For example, some days I'll do intervals using watts. Does anyone train with watts? This is the best way to train. Okay, when you go and do a Concept 2, a ski erg, or a rower, or a bike, you wanna be looking at watts and compare your power. And so ideally, you should do, for most men, train around 300 to 600 watts. If you're doing HIIT training for women, it could be 200 to 400. And you wanna vary the intervals. So you might do a great way to, what I like to do, on 3 to 4 days per week, I will do a 15-second all-out sprint at about 600 watts and do a minute rest in between and do 3 or 4 sets of those. The next day, I might do a longer, say 60 or 90-second interval at say 400 watts or 350 watts on the Concept 2. So you wanna vary the duration and the intensity. And so you would match your interval with, let's say your interval is 90 seconds, you would do 90 seconds rest, then the next set. And just doing these sort of interval workouts 3 to 4 days per week, you can improve your fitness overall. Which again, this translates into health benefits. We're talking about for men, improving erectile function. For women, we're talking about improving the health of the brain, improving fat loss, and reducing, in my opinion, the most important thing, cardiovascular disease. I've heard of so many reports here over the last several years, especially post-COVID, of people just dying. Sudden cardiac death, high blood pressure, things like that. And the question is, well, why? It seems that throughout the pandemic, at least not so much here in Scandinavian countries, but in North America and other parts of Europe, we have confined people. And many people are not as sedentary, or more sedentary compared to years past. And so we're seeing a dramatic increase in excess deaths. And I strongly suspect this is because many people have been increasingly sedentary for a long period of time. And now's the time to reverse that. We're seeing rises in the UK with heart disease, especially in young people. So when we're sedentary, we dramatically increase the risk of heart disease. We increase our blood pressure. We worsen our blood sugar regulation. Now, you might be saying, well, why don't we hear so much about exercise? We hear a lot about, at least in North America, about calories. And this causes the mainstream medical community and dietitians to not focus so much on exercise. But I wanna share with you, this is a study called the calorie study. This has been cited thousands of times. And many people will say, well, it's more important just to cut your calories. If you wanna improve your overall health, just cut your calories. And what this study actually did, which was interesting, they had a control group, and this is body weight here over time, okay? So what you're seeing is 24 months. The control group is not changing their diet. One group didn't change their exercise, but they cut their calories by 25%. The third group cut their calories by just 15% and then exercised to just get another 10% reduction in their calorie intake. Now, you might be looking at this and say, well, exercise probably doesn't matter. You lose the same amount of weight if you cut your calories or if you cut your calories a little bit in exercise. But here's what you don't really hear about. Here's the study protocol, as I mentioned, okay? The outcomes of this, I think, are pretty important as it pertains to metabolic health. What you see here, this is diastolic blood pressure, an important independent risk factor for heart disease. Blood pressure reduced almost double in the group that exercise and cut their calories to the same degree as individuals who just cut their calories. But what's even more important is you get a 66% improvement in insulin sensitivity by just exercising as a way to decrease your calorie intake. And you also get a huge improvement in your HDL cholesterol. So when faced with the option, should I diet or exercise or do a little bit of both if I want to optimize longevity and metabolic health? My opinion, and based upon this study and many others, we should be doing both, not just focusing on cutting calories and dieting. Many people promote this in the fitness community, and there's nothing wrong with dieting per se. But when you exercise as well, you have a lot more buffer room and you have better improvements in metabolic health. And as you just heard, we talked about how diabetes is on the rise here in Denmark and all throughout Europe and the world, really. You'll soon learn how exercise is a wonderful tool to improve insulin sensitivity and blood sugar health. But even more important, here's what I think is fascinating. The group that did just a little bit of exercise to get into that calorie deficit improved their VO2 max 22%. Compared to the group who did nothing, their VO2 max actually went down. So the delta there is actually about 27% difference in just half a year's time. This is really important because, again, that New England Journal of Medicine study found that a decrease in VO2 max is unequivocally linked with increased risk of dying from heart disease. So this group that lost almost the same amount of weight that only cut their calories also reduced their risk of dying and cardiovascular disease. So I think that's really important. Does anyone here do intermittent fasting? Quite a lot of you. Okay, I'm gonna share with you this study. This study is incredibly fascinating. And they found that when they compared individuals who exercised and had a relatively high VO2 max for their age and body weight compared to people who do not exercise, they found that after just 12 hours, there was orders of magnitude differences in the autophagy initiation proteins. So when we talk about fasting in the context of longevity and whole body health, one of the targets that we like to focus on is autophagy. This is an intracellular cleanup process. Well, it turns out that if you don't exercise but you fast, you do not get the same increase in this really critically important process known as autophagy. So the take home here is if you habitually exercise and you fast, you get much more mileage or efficiency with your fast. So you don't have to fast as long. There's been many people that are like doing 3-day fast or 5-day only water fast or even dry fasting. This can get really, I think, excessive at times. If you regularly exercise, you can increase your autophagy by just doing a 12-hour fast, by just doing regular time-restricted feeding, which I think is important. Does anyone here, like for example, I recommend eating between 10 and 6, 10 a.m. and 6 roughly, depending upon the time of year. This is a great feeding window. You could bump it up to 12 to 8, something along those lines. But again, if you regularly exercise, you don't need to do these excessively long fasts because your machinery, your metabolic machinery is much more efficient. All right, I think we're doing good on time. Now here's what's really interesting. It turns out that if we just sit, and you all in Denmark don't have this problem. Many of you rode your bikes here, walked to this presentation, I'm sure. But in other parts of Europe and North America, when we sit and we're not getting those 9,000 steps per day that I mentioned, we have a really hard time actually burning fat when we exercise. So this is a researcher, his name is Edward Coyle at UT Austin, and he's done a bunch of different studies where he randomizes people to only get 2,000 steps per day or instruct them to get 8,000 steps per day, and then has them do a 60-minute exercise session. The people who only get 2,000 steps per day do not have a significant increase in fat oxidation when they are exercising. That's really important. And so we all have friends who are like, look, I'm going to the gym, I'm dieting, but I'm not losing the weight. And then you think, well, what else are they doing? Are they walking? How many steps per day are they getting? So if you're having a hard time losing body fat and you're exercising, going to the gym, doing HIIT classes or riding your bike, etc., you might want to focus on how many steps you're getting per day, because it turns out that in this study they found that the best blood sugar response and response to fat oxidation during exercise occurred when individuals were doing between 6,000 and 8,000 steps a day. So it's just another tool to improve your body composition and beyond. So we've talked a lot about metabolic health up to now. This is statistics here in the US, in my home country, where literally 93% of adults have some degree of poor metabolic health. They're on the trajectory of developing diabetes, developing obesity, increased waist circumference, body fat percentage. It's really pretty dismal when you look at the statistics. So this is a trend that if the world adopts what individuals are doing in America, where things will head. If you look at even in Australia, in India, in China, diabetes and obesity are increasing throughout the world, and they're impacting kids and beyond. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's really, really sad. It turns out that one of the most effective things that we can do, as I mentioned, is exercise. And this is research I shared. This is one of my favorite studies, by the way. And I've been reading and rereading this study. This was done here in Copenhagen, it turns out, that diabetes actually starts in our legs. This is what the research is showing. So our legs are made to move and to evolve. So we should be doing a lot of walking and resistance training. It turns out that as your blood sugar health starts to get compromised, this is the control group, this is the diabetic individuals, that you don't have as much glucose absorption in your leg tissue as you become more insulin resistant. So if you want to improve your metabolic health and your blood sugar health, you definitely need to do things like squats. You need to do lunges. You need to do hip thrusts. You need to do deadlifts. You need to even do sprints or hill repeats. You need to move your legs. Your legs are really important, and it probably is due to blood flow. Your legs are pretty distal from your heart. Has anyone ever got a foot infection by something like stepping on a nail or a screw or what have you? They take a long time to heal because it's really far away from your body. And it turns out that if you're not stimulating your legs, you're not getting blood flow into your legs. And I hypothesize that this is why cold plunge and sauna is so healthy, because we're moving blood to our legs and doing the inverse when we get cold. So if there's one thing that a second takeaway, in addition to walking 9,000 steps per day, and doing resistance training 3 to 4 days per week, make sure you're doing some leg exercise pretty much every day. And that could be walking, that could be taking the stairs, that could be doing a set of squats, that could be doing lunges. I'm gonna share with you specifics shortly. Your legs are really important. Now, the other thing, let's see, this is, I think, sorry. I was sharing with you all the leg stuff. Here's the leg slide. Let me go back. This is the upper body. Here's what's really cool. For those of us who like to do resistance training, the more muscle mass you have in the upper body, the overall more metabolic potential you will have, because the musculature in the upper body doesn't get as insulin resistant early in the disease process. So doing things like bicep curls, chest presses, pull-ups, push-ups, bench press are all good exercises for metabolic health. And as I mentioned, this study talks about it, between 60 and 100% of post-meal glucose gets absorbed in your muscle. Your muscle is a glucose and leptin sponge. So if you go to the doctor, or you have a friend that goes to the doctor and they hear that they're pre-diabetic, tell them they need to start exercising. Really important, really effective. All right, this was a study that I mentioned. This is Journal of the American Medical Association, a high-impact, highly reputable journal. They tracked people for 10 years. This was a group of firemen in Indiana, back in the US. And they wanted to see if exercise capacity or strength was linked with dying over the course of a 10-year period. And what they found is in men, if individuals could not do 10 push-ups, their risk of dying was orders of magnitude higher compared to individuals who could do 40 or more push-ups. So it turns out that strength is really important. It's a vital sign. VO2 max and strength is a vital sign. In my opinion, it's as important as your blood cholesterol or your blood pressure. Okay, 10 minutes, all right. So, really important information here from JAMA. So when you're doing push-ups or you're going to the gym, not only is that making you feel better mentally, not only is that improving the health of your muscles, but that's reducing your risk of dying, which I think is pretty profound. All right, so we hear a lot about the harms of fat. Excessive belly fat is bad. You don't want to be overweight. You don't want too much fat. But what about muscle? It turns out that the loss of muscle is an independent risk factor for a litany of different conditions. And it turns out that yes, having too much fat is a problem, no question. But we focus too much on losing fat, not enough on supporting the health and the maintenance of muscle. It turns out that yes, this is risk of death and different, this is the hazard ratios, I believe, for risk of dying. But you look here, the loss of muscle is linked with increased risk of dying from all sorts of conditions, cancer, heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and so forth. So we should not just be monomaniacally focused on reducing fat, we should also focus on increasing muscle and strength. And it turns out that researchers are talking about this. They're talking about strength span. You've heard of health span or lifespan. We should focus on maintaining strength over time as well. This is really important. And that's why, you know, we talked about VO2 Max. That's more aerobic. Your cardiorespiratory system, great to focus on that, but we should also focus on strength. And that's why I mentioned a minimum of resistance training 3 days per week, full body. And we'll quickly go through that as we go on here. Okay. This is a great video by Peter Attia on the Huberman Lab podcast. I don't have time to go through that, but he talks about how basically strength is inversely correlated with lifespan and risk of dying. So if you're getting weaker over time, that's not a good thing. We gotta focus on strength and protein, which we're gonna finish up on here shortly. But there's a lot of great tests here to look at your pace of biologic aging. Has anyone looked at this? DNA methylation, the epigenetic aging. This is a newly discovered tool that we can utilize to assess how we're aging. And it turns out that as you lose body strength, that is linked with an increased risk of aging more fastly, more quickly. So we want to focus on strength. And this is a friend of mine. He's a personal trainer. He's in his 70s. He routinely has his clients who are in their 80s doing deadlifts and squats and cleans. Many of his clients are in their 70s and 80s doing bro exercises that you might see high school football players do. But these individuals are super healthy, they're free of disease, they move well. So again, these compound movements are things that you should be focusing on. And why do we focus on these? Because when we move our muscle, we release all these different proteins. As I mentioned, over 600 different genes and proteins are activated when we habitually exercise. This is really good. And these myokines and exokines go everywhere, to your brain, to your pancreas, to your heart, to your liver, to your brain and beyond. All right, we already talked about walking and the importance of that. So let's get into some specifics. Oh, by the way, we hear about blue zones all the time. Well, individuals who are super centenarians eat more of a plant-based diet, you might hear. You know the one commonality with all these different blue zone regions is these individuals are very recreationally active. Most oftentimes they walk to see relatives, friends, and families in the hillside, in parts of Greece, parts of Italy, parts of Costa Rica, the blue zone regions, even in Japan. They garden, super centenarians are moving a lot. So we've looked a lot at nutrition and tried to make these correlations with a Mediterranean diet or a plant-based diet and odds of living to become a centenarian. But it turns out that many of the studies are now looking at exercise as a tool to improve longevity. So it turns out that we can do things just at home. This was just one of many studies looking at, you don't have to go to a gym. You can do jumps, you can do box squats, you can do lunges, and improve various independent risk factors for aging. This was just one of many studies looking at different intervals that you can do, which I think is quite profound. It turns out that exercise improves hippocampal volume. So the part of the brain where you concentrate and store memories. So just by moving your muscles, especially trying new exercises. Maybe if you've never tried Pilates, go to a Pilates class. If you've never tried yoga, try doing yoga. These different exercises are associated with improving the functionality of the brain and reducing cortical thinning, which we're all prone to over time. So I think that's really important. But here's a slide that I think is the most important slide in this whole slide deck. And that is comparing individuals who habitually exercise and do a 45-minute exercise session, comparing subjects' blood sugar levels if they do 3 15-minute sessions. So when you break your exercise sessions up into smaller little chunks, a 15-minute exercise session here, a 20-minute walk there, especially in the post-meal window, you get a dramatic reduction and improvement in your overall blood sugar levels. So I think that's an important thing to take away here. It's not just going to the gym for 90 minutes and then saying, I'm good for the rest of the day, I don't need to do any movement. That's actually not ideal. You should be breaking that up. That doesn't mean that you can't go to the gym for 90 minutes, but you should also be moving throughout the day. Okay, so let's get into, I wanna just highlight cardiovascular disease. It turns out that insulin resistance is linked with plaquing of your coronary arteries. So post-meal walks, exercise, all of these things improve your blood sugar regulation, which would reduce the risk of plaquing in your coronary arteries. So let's finish up on Specific exercises. Remember, compound movements, moving 2 or more joints at the same time. I want to finish up on some of my most effective exercises. Does anyone do the hip thrusts? This is a very effective exercise for your glutes. Your glutes are actually your biggest muscle in your entire body. So you should be stimulating them. So something like a lunge, when you lunge, you're actually activating your glutes, your hamstrings, and the entire posterior chain. So this is a phenomenal way for both men and women to improve the health of their muscles. Really important. This is a great screenshot-worthy summary of this study and all the studies we've been talking about in terms of how to structure your exercise training, what the latest scientific advancements show. So we want to do, again, compound movements 3 to 4 days per week at a bare minimum. And if you don't have much time, you can superset. You can do an upper body pull, lower body pull. Upper body push the next day, lower body push the next day. So we can superset these things. And instead of, if you're short on time, you can just skip the rest or go to a different exercise and then go back to your primary exercise. For example, you can do some pull-ups and go and do some lunges. Then, and if you're, again, short on time, do another set of pull-ups, then lunges. So just think about breaking these up and having more novelty in your training program. You can do this at your home office. You can do this in the work. You can do some Bulgarian split squats. A great exercise for your glutes, great exercise for your quads and your hamstrings and beyond. If you're new to pull-ups and resistance training, get some bands. They cost $5. So I have my mom now doing pull-ups. I have my daughter doing pull-ups using bands. There's nothing wrong with using bands or assistance during your exercise program. Okay, let's finish up on protein. Protein's really important. We can't talk about exercise without talking about protein. There's a big push here in Northern Europe as well as throughout the world to push individuals to eat a more plant-based protein diet. It turns out that plant protein doesn't stimulate muscle tissue to the same degree as animal-based proteins. So I just want you to know that. You can be a healthy vegan, a healthy vegetarian, but you're not gonna get the same stimulation to your skeletal muscle. This was a great study where they randomized individuals to have an omnivorous meal versus a vegan meal. The differences in muscle protein synthesis were dramatic, okay? So we can eat more grass-fed, more locally procured animal products and still support environmental sustainability while optimizing whole body and metabolic health. And I want you just to see this slide right here. So as you exercise, you need to have more protein, especially if you're new to exercise. Ideally around 1.6 grams per kilogram of lean body weight. So you might be saying, well, how do I figure that out? It's very simple. Your homework is to get a DEXA scan to figure out your lean body mass. And then you figure out how much lean body mass you have, and you multiply that. You want 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass. That way, as you get older, you're supporting muscle protein synthesis and muscle health, okay? Now, if you have disease, if you have diabetes, if you're sedentary, you might even need to have a little bit more protein. But especially when you're new to exercise, you need to have more protein because your muscles are starting to build. They're starting to accommodate the increased resistance to the exercises and beyond. Last slide right here. When we cut our calories, we tend to preferentially lose muscle mass. So if you're dieting to lose body fat and to lose your weight, you need even more protein. And you also need to do resistance training as well. So that, my friends, is it. If you want these slides, here's a screenshot, the main summary here. We had a lot to talk about. If you want these slides, you can opt in to my newsletter at highintensityhealth.com. Everyone's got a screenshot of this, which is fantastic. We're gonna take Q&A shortly. You can find me over on YouTube, High Intensity Health, on Instagram at Metabolic Mike. I'm grateful for your attendance, and we'll take some live questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. Well, we actually only have 30 seconds, so one short question. Down there, do we have the running mic? 2 seconds. The mic is coming there. Super, thank you.
What's the best time to exercise, taking into account the feeding window and the time-restricted feeding as well, to support autophagy?
Amazing question. The best time to exercise is the time where you will habitually do it. From a circadian rhythm standpoint, I don't think there's any research to show that if you exercise in the morning versus the evening, there might be more of a catabolic effect in the morning because cortisol is higher and so forth. But you probably know this. If you exercise in the morning, you're more likely to do it compared to if you postpone it to later in the day, because things come up, your kids, your obligations, your partner, your work. So I think the best, I wouldn't focus so much on that. Most people are not that there, you know, to really split hairs in that context. So focus on exercising when it works best for your lifestyle. But great, phenomenal question.
Super. Thank you very much, Mike. I think we could have continued for a couple of hours,
Yeah,
right? But unfortunately, we do not have the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, friends, we'll be back here in 10 minutes.